All right, should be recording now. So today we have Joseph Nolla joining us. So why don't you start off by telling us a little bit about who you are?
Yeah, so I'm a Jesuit, which is an order of men in the Catholic Church. Kind of, you have like Benedictine monks and Franciscan friars. You have Jesuits. And right now I am studying to become a Catholic priest.
Cool. So what was your religious background and upbringing like? Were you always Catholic, or did you kind of go through like some kind of evolution to get to kind of the views that you hold now?
Yeah, so I was raised Catholic. And then in high school, I stopped believing.
Okay.
And was an atheist for about 6 years. And then gradually came back to the Catholic Church.
Okay. Yeah. So you want to talk about that? Like, what was it? What kind of stuff kind of caused you to doubt, at least initially during that phase where you were an atheist? What was some of the issues for you?
So I think probably the first one that kind of started this disillusionment was the hypocrisy that I would see within the church. Having lived a few years before high school overseas, and then kind of coming back to the States, and just seeing this is in the deep South,
Mm-hmm.
just seeing what I really thought were really kind of not super Christian ways of behaving and seeing things, like this kind of nationalism
Right.
that I was seeing. And so that really turned me off and kind of started this disillusionment. And then also, to an extent, I mean, Christianity just kind of feels like a fairy tale, and and it just so the hypocrisy combined with, but I mean, this can't. Well, I mean, come on, that really went a long way into my doubts, for sure.
Yeah. Was it more? What was some of the stuff that started to? You said it was a process where you moved back. What was some of the things that helped move you back after? Because once you become disillusioned like that, it can be difficult to go back, to a previous belief. So, what were some of the things that started that kind of transition back into faith?
So, a lot of it, I would say, was probably just kind of being a guy in my early 20s, just searching for things, which kind of made me a little more open to possibly whether there be a God or not. But I remember the kind of the moment where I stopped being an atheist. I was driving. I was stationed. I was in the military, so I was stationed in at a base in Panama City, and I would drive every weekend about an hour down the road to where my then fiance lived, and spend time with her. And every day that I would make that trip, I had to drive by this Catholic church, their St. Dominic's. And to this day, I've never once been in that church. But whenever I would drive by, I would kind of, maybe feel like maybe I should be in there. And the last time I drove by that I can remember, I decided, well, let me at least think about my atheism again, and just see what happens. See if this is something I believe or not. And I use the term "see" if it's something I believe, because, to be honest with you, I don't really buy the idea that belief and something like being convinced that something is true or not is something that we so much choose to do. I think we tend to notice if we're convinced about something.
Right.
So I just wanted to see, well, what do I believe, really? So I was thinking about, well, as I understood cosmology at the time, that the universe very likely had a beginning, that there was a time when there wasn't any matter at all, as if you will. There's a before matter. So I decided, well, let me go back in my mind, in my imagination, into the void as a kind of passive observer, and let me just see what happens interiorly? How do I react and respond to the event of matter? And so, you know, in my mind, I'm knocking around there in the void, just chilling, and then boom, a little tiny singularity, that piece of matter appears, and I noticed that my thoughts immediately are just, my first thought was like, holy shit, what's going on here? You know, why is this matter here? You know, and again, continually asking why, and figuring that there must be an explanation for it, an intelligibility behind it. And also realizing that I was having this assumption that there was someone in intelligence who could answer that question. I think that I'm not just asking, you know, into the void, why, that I'm actually directing that to someone. And that made me realize that, okay, I can't really, with honesty, call myself an atheist. That was probably, I didn't become a Christian then. You know, I was really just more of a deist. I believed in a creator, but whether or not this creator was loving, or, you know, wanted a relationship, or was, say, like how some people see God as like a judge, all that other stuff. No, just a creator. And as the years went on, eventually snail pacing my way back to Catholicism.
Yeah. So it seems like what you're describing is like, so it was a combination of sort of, I mean, I guess maybe not at the time, maybe it wasn't like technical arguments or something like that, but it was like thinking about like, why is there something rather than nothing sort of kind of thoughts, as well as maybe, like you said, it seemed like you were describing a sense of God's presence in a way, maybe not like in a loving way, because you said just kind of a creator, sense of a creator, where you felt like in your mind, you had noticed, like you said, that you were starting to ask that kind of question as if there was someone to answer it. So it's more, like you said, it was more of a realization than it was, you just came to this conclusion, you know, through all these steps. But it's interesting, there's an analogy, I think, the atheist YouTuber Apologia, he was talking similarly about beliefs and how we don't normally choose what convinces us. And he was saying, like, he used an analogy of like underwater chickens or something like that. Like chickens that live underwater. It's like, believe in the underwater chickens. It's like, do it. It's like, you can't make yourself believe in underwater chickens. Like, it just, you know, you can't choose to believe that. So, you know, that's just kind of an analogy for what you're saying, where, you know, what convinces us isn't necessarily something we choose. But anyway, I don't want to go on a tangent about that. I just thought it was interesting. Way to piggyback off of that. What branch of the military were you in?
Air Force.
Okay. Yeah. I was in the Navy for 4 years. So
okay.
Yeah, I was wondering, curious. So so when was your Catholicism, in the sense that you were raised Catholic, was it more because now it seems like I don't know, I don't want to say progressive, but it seems like in a lot of ways you're more progressive than other people. Was that the kind of Catholicism you were raised in, or is it sort of different as your views evolved? Now, well, the kind of positions that you hold.
Yeah, you know, there are approaches and styles that probably wouldn't have been so present or current when I was being raised. The focus, I would say, when I was growing up, would have been much more on, you know, the externals, the formal things. So much more of the sacramental life, practices, certain prayers, but the Catholicism of my family has also, it's been evolving and changing over time as well. Yeah, but I would say that it certainly wasn't as progressive, if you will, as it is now. Yeah,
I don't, you know, sometimes people have different perceptions of what people mean by the term progressive. You know, you might be conservative in some ways and not in other ways, you know, traditionally defined. So it just depends. I just wanted to make sure, you know, I don't want to use terms incorrectly. So I think I remember hearing you say something like that. I don't know if it would say your views on the Bible evolved. I think you said something about having, at least within the Catholic Church, there's a freedom to not necessarily be nailed down to these fundamentalist approaches to the Bible. I don't remember exactly what you said, but do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. Just kind of like what are sometimes called the higher forms of criticism.
Mm-hmm.
So like the historical critical method, and the very types of like literary criticism, formal criticism, yada yada yada, those type of things. I had, particularly once I came back to the church and really kind of got into it, I kind of had that zeal that is often kind of marked by sort of defensiveness, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Like, for example, like I would have wanted to have been an apologist and just, go around, Frank Turecking and, debating people and yada, 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 Like I would have wanted that kind of stuff, Now that's definitely not my style at all. But those are the kind of things I would have wanted to do, where I had this mindset where I would look for threats to the church, or what I perceive as threats, and try and defeat them. But then, the more I studied, and I think also just the more I matured, and the more I guess grew in faith, the more I realized that these things aren't necessarily threats. We're historical people. Like we live in history. Religions are a product of history. So if we want to really understand our religion, we have to actually look at history honestly, like realistically, and not just pretend that it was something different. And realizing that the Catholic Church gave a green light to that was liberating, and it helped to change a mindset where I'm not looking for threats. I'm not seeing threats. I'm learning, and I'm able to learn from non-Catholics, from non-Christians, from non-believers, and just grow as a person, and trying to accompany others in their own growth.
Yeah, I do think I think it's fair to say, regardless of whatever else anyone wants to say about the foundation for like the Catholic Church, at a minimum, a lot of Protestant approaches to the Bible almost force, not everyone, but like they kind of force this kind of, the text has to be this in order, or else it all collapses. Whereas more, Catholicism, the authority is more placed within, the scripture is part of the tradition,
right?
Rather than like the foundation for. I mean, it is a foundation in a sense, but the tradition itself is more the foundation in Catholicism. Whereas in a lot of Protestant approaches to the Bible, it can kind of be conducive to trying to force it to be what you want it to be, rather than what it actually is. This collection of texts written over thousands of years with differing perspectives in a lot of cases, but yeah, I definitely can see that. So why? I don't know. I'm not as informed on Catholicism. I mean, I know some, but not as much as I am on Protestantism. But so what's again, I know a little bit about this, but you want to explain the significance of the Jesuit order of priests, and like why you explain significance, and then why you specifically were attracted to that.
Sure. Yeah. The first moment I can actually think of being aware of the Jesuits and attracted to them was I was watching The Exorcist with my then fiance. And have you seen The Exorcist?
It's been a while, but yeah.
Yeah. So like it's the very opening scene where Father Marin is on an archaeological dig in Iraq, and I'm sitting there and I'm watching this. I'm kind of thinking, well, this is guy, and I'm an atheist at the time. I'm thinking this guy's kind of got it made. I mean, it's actually pretty cool. Here's this priest out there doing archaeology. How crazy is that? And I mentioned that to my parents later, and I kind of talked like it was just a hobby that this priest had. And they were like, well, no, I mean, that character is a Jesuit. I mean, he's not just playing at archaeology. He's probably a no-joke archaeologist. And I remember kind of thinking, wow, well, I don't really go much for this God thing, but these Jesuits, they're all right. They have this academic prowess that attracted me. And once I kind of came back to the church, and things I went separate ways with the fiance. Just kind of dating around for a while, and things aren't really landing. And I say as a joke, just a total joke. I didn't mean a word of it. I said, if by the time I retire from the Air Force, and if I'm not married, do you think the Jesuits would take me? I said that's a total joke. I mean, like, meant nothing of it. But that stupid joke planted a seed, and it just wouldn't go away. This idea of being a Jesuit. And I hated it. I absolutely hated it. More than anything, I just hated the idea of celibacy. But I would try and sort of run away from the idea, and was kind of running for about a year, and it got to the point where I was like, okay, well, so what about maybe being a Jesuit? Why do I care? And my answer, well, if that's what Jesus wants me to do. I was like, okay, all right. Now, why do I care about what Jesus wants? What can I do maybe to dilute Jesus, to make him just a mere mortal without any kind of claim over me? So I bought a Quran, and I started going to the local mosque for Friday prayers, and I would meet with the imam afterwards, and I would do this for a couple months, kind of trying to bring in this process of making an informed conversion to Islam. And it was a wonderful experience. The imam was a gentle, lovely man. And I was this close to converting to Islam when I realized that I was miserable. And it's probably not the best space to be in to make an important life decision, So I looked back and I thought, okay, well, when was the last time that I felt joy and peace? And it was as a practicing Catholic. So I made an appointment with a priest, and I started the conversation really kind of in the most arrogant way I could think of. I said to him, I'm going through a crisis of faith right now. I've been flirting with Islam. I'm open to coming back to Catholicism. Convince me, like that's why I started the conversation.
Arms folded.
Yeah, but this priest, God love him, he wasn't having it. He didn't pull any punches. He said, I don't need to convince you to have faith. As far as I can tell, you probably have plenty of faith, but you know who you are. You're the rich young man in the Gospels who doesn't want to give up everything and follow Jesus. What are you so afraid of? And to be honest, I don't think that approach would be wise to use for everyone at all who has any kind of doubts. But in reality, it was what I needed to hear. Mm-hmm. Because the answer I gave immediately was the first time I'd ever said this out loud. I said, I am terrified that God is calling me to become a Jesuit priest. And as soon as I finally said that out loud and admitted it to myself, this wave of peace surged over me. And I decided that I would actually take the time to seriously discern if I had a vocation. Unfortunately, though, I had never once in my life met a Jesuit. So how do I do that? But thankfully, just days later, I got orders to Jordan for deployment. So I shipped off to Jordan, and with my schedule, the only game in town that I could go to any kind of mass at all was this group, this small community of Jesuits in downtown Amman, where I could go early in the morning. And so I met up with them and began spiritual direction. They introduced me to Ignatian contemplation, which is a style of imaginative, contemplative prayer that St. Ignatius of Loyola, the founder of the Jesuits, used. And in those times, and in those prayers and those conversations, I felt confirmation of a vocation to the Jesuits. So that's kind of how that started and went down.
So tailoring back around to what makes them unique is that they usually have vocations and like study in certain areas because you mentioned like the archaeology and stuff like that. Like what sets their order apart from like, something else? Did they have vocation?
Well, yeah. So I was using a vocation just in the broader Christian and Catholic, I should say, mindset of a calling.
Okay.
But as far as but they are kind of set apart in some way as far as the approach and style that they have. For example, the Jesuits are, by their own constitutions and by the rules of the church, actually required to be better educated than the average priest. So we study longer before we're ordained, and we work longer before we're ordained. And very often you'll have Jesuits who are archaeologists, scientists. I think there are something like 13 or so craters on the moon named after the Jesuits who discovered them, and all sorts of, and they run the Vatican observatories. And so you have a lot of scientists who are Jesuits, a lot of doctors, mathematicians, and then, parish priests, chaplains, all sorts of stuff. So there's even there's even a Broadway actor, who's a Jesuit. They do all sorts of things.
Yeah. So taking this in a slightly, well, maybe not just slightly different direction, it says that in your bio on Twitter, it says that you like good punk rock music.
Yeah.
What's good punk rock music?
Okay. So I'm pretty eclectic, when it comes to that. But so I think of so I love the stuff from the 70s and the 80s, and either whether it's like kind of like that more hardcore stuff like Minor Threat, or stuff like The Damned or The Clash. Well, I really like The Clash. But probably the band in the 70s, 80s that I'm most into would be the Misfits. I was even in a Misfits cover band, for a while, and it's kind of weird to see kind of like this dude who's doing the Misfits, all of a sudden is like a Jesuit who still listens to the Misfits, but but these days I listen a lot to the Menzingers and Against Me, the Gaslight Anthem, Hot Water Music. Mainly I just look for really good songwriting. That's what I go for.
So the other thing was in the bio was that you're an avid reader. So is that like, is that like mainly nonfiction, fiction? Like what kind of stuff are you most interested in reading?
It's pretty much almost anything under the sun as far as fiction or nonfiction goes. A lot of it, I think, is informed by kind of being a history buff. So I sort of look at those texts that were, kind of historically relevant and important to the cultures around the world, and I just try and tap into those and check them out. So I love the classics.
Okay. Yeah. Do you mean like religious texts? Like you mentioned the Quran and stuff like that. Like, is that something you're interested in as well?
Oh yeah, I'm interested in all that stuff, but also just like the more artistic, or I guess the more intentionally and overtly artistic stuff. Yeah. So like I love the Shakespeare and a lot of stuff as well. Dostoevsky sometimes.
Yeah, my reading was definitely taking a turn. Now I'm more getting into the waters of philosophy of religion and stuff like that. So,
yeah.
I mean,
I hear it. Me too.
Before it was more. I mean, when I was I was kind of raised within like pop evangelicalism, and I moved to like Southern Baptist context, and then eventually I was within the Reformed tradition, confessional Reformed tradition near the end. So I was reading a lot of theology, coming from like the Westminster seminaries and all that kind of stuff. But as I would read like apologetics and stuff like that too, like as a Christian. But for me, my deconversion from Christianity wasn't necessarily. It was not like there's no God. It was more like I don't know if I believe Jesus rose from the dead specifically, because it was a combination of things. Like I would say, not to go on too much of a personal tangent, but like for me personally, I'm pretty naturally skeptical of miracle claims. And so some of the things that were undergirding my belief in the resurrection were the idea that, the Bible had some objective markers in it, that it was divine in origin, and that like there is this prophecy, the prophecy in the Old Testament. Obviously you could make a case, even if you don't have a conservative doctrine of inerrancy, you can still make a case that there's a lot of foreshadowing in the Old Testament that points to Jesus. But, my view was that there was more clear, prophecy to Jesus, and then it kind of evolved that it wasn't. And so there's like, in other words, there was like these kind of pillars that held up my resurrection belief that started to kind of fall away. But what I'm kind of tying back to what I'm talking about now is like, after I deconverted, it was when I was starting to really think about theism. So I went through a period of agnosticism where it was more, after I deconverted, I was like, I want some space to think about these topics and start to kind of dive into the best of like, is there a God specifically or not? But, now I'm an atheist, but it's still interesting to like, plow through some of this stuff. I think one of the best, there was a really good interaction book. I don't know if you've read it or know what it is. It's like, is God the best explanation of things? It was by Joshua Rasmussen and Felipe Leon. It's like a dialogue book, like a high level philosophy dialogue book that I thought was really great, really great. But anyway, yeah, it's definitely some dense reading now. So it's been interesting for sure.
I hear, yeah, just coming off a semester, and it's been I'm in grad school right now studying, yeah, so some dense reading in the philosophy of religion, but it's I like it. It's exciting.
Yeah, no, the only, like I said in a different stream, the only thing that really bores me is the ontological argument. I know that, yeah. I don't know if it's just because like it's not used, popularly, but I'm plowing through Graham Oppy's Arguing About Gods right now, and I had read parts of it before, like it was more of a reference book for me before, where I was like reading a chapter here and there, but I was like, no, I need to go all the way through this, and now the first section is about ontological arguments, and I'm just like, oh my gosh, like it's dense.
Yeah. That's a very charitable thing to say about the ontological. I'm not a fan. I'm just really not a fan of it at all.
Dense. Yeah. So you had also recently, because I follow you on Twitter and stuff, you had given like a pretty large string of tweets discussing Christian stereotypes of atheists. And there was a couple that you did in succession. You want to briefly discuss that?
Yeah, well, I really kind of just owe that to you, to be totally honest with you. When you asked this, you opened it out there to theists or Christians in particular. I don't remember, but kind of ask about like the stereotypes that atheists, agnostics have, and I thought that was such a thoughtful question, and really good for kind of opening dialogue. So I was like, oh my gosh, like this guy just inspired me. Let me let me flip it around and ask this to atheists and agnostics. What are the stereotypes that Christians have? And I was fortunate to get like a very large number of responses back, and it was and honestly, in my opinion, it was beautiful. Just to and it was, I felt very privileged, to hear these things from non-believers, to kind of hear what they've been experiencing, and then to try and share what I learned from them with other Christians. Say, hey, let's stop doing this kind of shit, and saying these things. And what it's kind of done is it's kind of just sort of kind of confirmed and helped me. That's what I think is probably most pressing and urgent, in my opinion, in the dialogue and interaction between Christians and non-believers, and that is trying to reverse this trend of dehumanization and demonization. And I'll be honest with you, I frankly blame Christians more for it. I see dehumanization among atheists and agnostics, but I mean, who threw the first stone in this fight? I mean, let's be honest with you. I feel like it's the Christians who did, and trying just to kind of reverse this and try and cultivate a sense of empathy that kind of like, hey, atheists have reasons, legitimate reasons for feeling and thinking and believing as they do. They're full persons, like let's not just paint them with broad brushes and treat them like they're this non-human entity. And like, no, these are full humans with full human lives, just like us. Right? Let's be real here, And I was also consoled to see the amount of positive support from atheists for doing this. Ideally, we are. I just want us to be friends. That's really what it just comes down to.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a point to the. I think a lot of what some people would consider, not all atheists are going to like the term fundamentalist atheist, but I sometimes think that's an apt description of some. But like, I do think there's a point there where a lot of it, I think, is reactionary towards a lot of harmful versions of religious belief. And so it's like, and that's why kind of is frustrating when if I don't do it all the time, but if anyone's familiar enough with my content, I do try to call out atheists that I think are not doing the best job representing atheism. We'll just put it mildly. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, I feel like there's so much attention to the new atheists, when in reality, like there's still so many more fundamentalist, harmful like versions of Christianity operating, at least in the United States. And I think you would agree with that, with like all the, Trump evangelical nonsense and stuff like that. But it's just, whatever quote unquote new atheism is, it's reactionary and it's way smaller than what's going on within like a lot of this silly evangelical stuff. And so again, I think that I think we should elevate the conversation some, but at the same time, it's like, I don't know why there's so much time spent discussing this. I don't know. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, like a lot of the attention just being thrown on the new atheists. I mean, because quite frankly, if you can just throw the attention on the new atheists and maybe a kind of more aggressive tone that they have, well, then the hardline fundamentalist doesn't have to do a lot of interior work and actually examine themselves. And I think there's a lot of avoiding going on and a lot of avoiding, trying to ignore some of the really strong claims that atheists offer, and trying to avoid that introspection and maybe, kind of wade around in doubt a little bit, and try and see what actually do I believe. I think there's a lot of fear about if they do this exploration, if they ask these kind of questions, they might not realize that they may realize that they're not exactly who they thought they are, and they don't believe exactly what they thought they believed. And what might this new me be? I think there's an understandable fear in that, and I think that gets, and I think there's a tendency to sort of take that out on other people.
Yeah, that's fair. I mean, it seems like, as you've said, like it's not just, well, when it comes to like atheism and stuff, it seems like the criticism isn't just like the rhetoric in the sense that it's strong rhetoric. It's that they often aren't as sophisticated as we would hope. But at the same time, like, a lot of times it's like, say someone like Christopher Hitchens, says something provocative and maybe says it the wrong way, whereas like a philosopher might have the same sentiment that he has, but phrase it differently. Mm-hmm. It's like all the attention goes on how Christopher Hitchens said the point he was trying to make, rather than like, okay, let's consider the point that he's making. Right. Even okay, he said it incorrectly. He's not a philosopher. He said it in a way that's not exactly rigorous, but there's an argument in the vicinity of what he's saying. And I guess that's what's frustrating about some of the discussion with that. But I don't take this on that kind of a tangent. But for me, I sometimes have some spicy rhetoric as well, but I try to balance that with it's mostly reserved for like hardline fundamentalists, honestly, but which is like why I have people like, I don't know if it was half, but like at least close to half of my interviews are with other Christians or with Christians. So because I don't like the idea of echo chambers, and I want to talk to other people that, we don't agree, but that's fine.
I hear it.
Let's see. So, well, I mean, I guess briefly, just because we kind of passed over it, but some of the stereotypes that you had tweeted about, which I'm assuming were some of the things that atheists were telling you, were something like that atheists don't have a concept of beauty and mystery, that atheism is a religion, which is profoundly silly. Devil worshiper, people worship. I don't know about everyone else, but I did have my personal quiet time with Satan this morning. Hopefully that's not
a nice, serene, quiet time.
Quiet time with Satan. Hopefully it's not offensive. I'm just playing around. But the other one was, people know, and this kind of can go both ways. Like we know the real reason, that you believe what you believe was the other one. And I think I wrote a couple of them down. No sense of morality. But yeah, definitely. And there's definitely a lot of stereotypes that atheists have towards Christians as well. And that's why I had asked the question on mine. I don't remember all of the responses, but it can be tricky with a lot of, and I want to be careful with saying like, psychoanalysis on both sides, but because sometimes I think on the one hand, at least people that left Christianity, like at least in my case, and based on my experience and the testimony of others, I do know in general that some Christians are experiencing cognitive dissonance for their beliefs. And so to say something like that in a broad sense is accurate. But a lot of the, I think the more harmful kinds of psychoanalysis, not harmful, maybe just tactfully unwise or tactically unwise uses of it is when like people on either side will just say, well, you right now are doing this thing. Like you right now, or you're just believing whatever you want to believe, even though, and if we zoom out, we know that that's true in some cases, but often the person we're talking with, you don't know them specifically. You don't know exactly what reasons they might have, just because it's true in a general sense that these, features are, happen in human beings doesn't mean that you can always zoom in and apply that in every situation. Mm-hmm. So I think that's one of the big mistakes, people can make in conversations, but.
Yeah, I think if we were to do like a Venn diagram of like the responses that you got and the responses that I got, I think that big one in the middle would be just the assumptions people make of people assuming that they know what's going on interiorly with a person, kind of like assuming that they know, well, I know what your motivations are. I know what's behind all of this. I know things that I just can't know about you in particular. And yeah, that seemed to be like the big common point between the two.
Right. So what would you say, as kind of a general question, but what would you say that, what kinds of misconceptions do people have about Catholicism?
Well, like a lot of the ones that I hear, are just, that we worship Mary, for example. Mm-hmm. Or we worship the saints. We don't. We just straight up don't do that. Let
me tell you about what you believe for a second.
Right. Yeah, right. Another one that I hear is that Catholics have to earn their salvation. This kind of, the Catholics are just essentially Pelagians, and that's, I think, a really unfortunate stereotype, especially because it's really just not even that much of a real issue anymore. This idea of justification by faith alone, for example, it's honestly at the top levels between the Vatican and a German conference of Lutheran bishops and scholars. They finally, after centuries, sat down and had a conversation about, let's actually talk about justification by faith alone, and really what this means. And once they actually talked and listened to each other, they found out we're actually a lot more on the same page than we had thought. Like very often, the Catholics will point to James 2 and say that we're not justified by faith alone, but by works. And a lot of Protestants will point to Romans, for example, and then talk about, that we're justified by faith and not works of the law. And so often I think that people try to talk about saying justification means different things in both contexts. But I think the stronger case to make is faith means different things in both contexts. Paul is talking about a lived, practiced faith. And James is talking about a mere intellectual assent. Hence he says kind of like the demons believe and tremble. But no, that kind of what we were talking about, like being convinced that something is true, but it's not lived. So realizing that, I don't know, there's a tendency to see disagreement where there really isn't that much of a disagreement. It's kind of frustrating.
Well, the Catholics are going to hell, so I gotta joke a little bit. So some of your stuff, I guess maybe it would be activism, but like, how does your faith inform your politics? Because definitely there's some of your tweets get into the realm of politics and stuff like that. Sure. Discuss that a little bit.
Well, it's not really how I thought my Twitter stuff would go. I really didn't anticipate it getting so political a lot of the time, but the way I see it, there's all these issues, that the world's facing, issues about justice, about racism, and what have you. And when I look at a lot of people in ecclesial positions and religious people and Catholic people tweeting only, pious things. There's nothing wrong with tweeting pious things, but if that's kind of like all they're doing and the world's burning outside, I mean, on one hand, you kind of want to say, hey man, like read the room a little bit, people are being, there's police brutality and there's racism and we're being silent about this? Dude, no. Like it's a loud silence. And I want people in their suffering and in their frustration to know that, what, you're not alone in this, in your suffering. I don't, from my privilege and my position, I don't know what exactly you're experiencing. But I'm here for you. And my heart goes out to you. And I want to stand in solidarity alongside you. So that informs a kind of activism and advocacy that I'm doing. Kind of like, where are people suffering? And how can I just express a solidarity with them?
Yeah, that's definitely interesting. What would you, I guess taking this a little bit of a different direction, kind of back, we talked a little bit about some of the things that caused you to question and to come back, at least in a certain point in your life. But now that you've probably read more and have had more time to reflect since then on some of these issues, what would you say that the arguments, I guess for Christianity or for theism, I guess it doesn't really matter what are some of the things that give you confidence in your beliefs and some of the things that having now a fuller understanding cause you to doubt your beliefs? So either both ways.
Yeah, so the understandings, it's actually kind of strange. I think subjectively, the strongest evidence is also objectively the weakest. The divine experience, for example, I think of as totally valid epistemologically as a support for belief. But on the flip side, it's only has any weight for the person who's experiencing that, and even then it has to be kind of taken with a grain of salt, because there's ways of interpreting those things, like how much am I projecting, how much am I in these divine experiences, how much is power of suggestion and whatnot, and it has no weight or bearing whatsoever on anyone else, But yeah, I do see some of the experiences that I have as kind of validating my belief.
I was going to say, not to interrupt, but I'd noticed because, well, I mean, at least initially you described like a sense of God. You ask a question and assume someone was there. And also even with the Jesuit thing, like I would even almost call it like an inward call that you had experienced over a long period of time. So it definitely seemed like religious experience in one way or another has been very important to you.
Yes.
And so it sounds like what you're saying is like, that's the strongest piece for, well, at least one of the strongest pieces for you, even though you realize that to other people, it may not hold any weight. Is that accurate?
Yeah. And I would say probably more than may not. It shouldn't really hold any weight. Yeah. If someone were to come to me and say, hey, like your religious experiences are really making me think about, wanting to become a Christian and yada, yada, yada. And maybe I believe this. I would kind of want to say, well, slow down, like that's mine, like this has, for all I know, I could be wrong about that, but what are your experiences and what are the objective things? Yeah.
Would you say, so it sounds like what you're saying is that you see, because there's different approaches, obviously, you probably know this, at least in philosophy towards religious experiences. There's some people that think that they can almost grant like some sort of incorrigible confidence. They have the power to grant that to a person, and others more look at them like a piece of evidence in the larger scheme. So that, it's not necessarily like, it's kind of like, I don't know, like prima facie versus ultima facie justification, where it's like,
yes,
on one hand, it gives you, like, I would say like someone like Randall Rouser, I don't know if you follow him on Twitter, a theologian, he's criticized people like William Lane Craig for kind of going too far with the religious experience thing, even though he is in the vein of what's called Reformed epistemology, and where he would say that, yes, you can have, knowledge is defined differently depending on, your scheme of it, but that you can have, what counts as knowledge based on religious experience, even though he wouldn't say that it should count as like this unassailable knowledge that could never be corrected. So it sounds like that's more what you're saying, where it's like it counts as at least prima facie.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So that is there any other? That's mainly like the strongest for you, or is there any other kind of like technical arguments that like cosmological or any like that give you confidence, or is it mainly?
Yeah. Well, the cosmological arguments, there's that kind of vein, are the ones that kind of resonate, because like in a way, that kind of imaginative thought experiment that I described was kind of just an imaginative version of a cosmological argument. Anyway, so I mean, it resonates. Yeah, but and I haven't read too much into them, but I know that there are really thoughtful critiques of the cosmological argument out there, and I'm wanting to get into them a little more. So I mean, I recognize that the cosmological arguments don't really, they haven't won the war, if you will. No, I mean it's still an ongoing discussion, and if we were to find out that the material universe is eternal and was never created, would that kind of undermine a belief in God, or at least a confidence in God? Yeah, I think it would.
Yeah. Well, that's the other point made. Like Jeff Lauder, I think you probably follow him too on Twitter, maybe. Like one of the points he makes too, at least with when it comes to like Big Bang stuff, is that the Big Bang doesn't actually say what happens before the singularity. It's that it's projecting based on that the singularity is there. It's not saying that literally something popped into being from nothing. Like that's not actually what it's saying. So I think there's some misconceptions there about what the Big Bang Theory actually is. It's talking about the expansion from a specific point, and we delve back, into different questions like, does it even make sense to say that, like, because time, space, and matter come to being at the same time, as far as I understand it, in the Big Bang. And so, like, does it make sense to even say that something happened before time? Like, there's all these questions, like, you start getting into that, and Yeah, it's it's definitely interesting for sure. And to be fair, at least for me, um, well, I didn't let you finish. What would you say that some of the things that cause you, and I'll answer these myself too, just be fair, not interrogating you, but what would you say some of the things that cause you to doubt your beliefs are, like now that you have a further understanding, like arguments from evil primarily, or is there anything else specifically?
So, I mean, the arguments from evil, um, they don't really impact me as much as I thought they would. Um, or I should say, they don't impact me in the way that I thought they would.
Mm-hmm.
I thought that maybe they would make me want to kind of question my belief in that God exists. Because I still believe in a creator. I figured like all right, so if the fact that that there is evil, and I think that the evidential argument for evil, I think is amazing. It doesn't get rid of the idea of a creator, but it certainly calls to question what can we say about this creator. And those are the things that it makes me wrestle with a
Mm-hmm.
lot. Where I think it's reasonable, understandable, and probably justified. I would think, for people. I mean, you can't blame us if God is real, and you can't blame us when we go and meet God to say, hey, God, I'm not going to be the only one that's going to be explaining myself today. I mean, I'm going to need some answers from you about all this shit that's happened. That's fair, I think. Maybe I'm an arrogant heretic, but I think that's fair to expect an explanation. I mean, it didn't work out for Job, but I mean, I'm not going to blame Job for it. I mean, I'm probably going to try and do what he did too, in that story.
Yeah.
But
Well, it's interesting too.
yeah,
I think one of the things that I think a lot of theists, it seems to me that a lot of theists are taking the route of an animal afterlife. I think you had mentioned that too. And I didn't know, the more I starting to read more philosophy of religion, the more I'm seeing people kind of take this route, because when once more and more people are starting to accept evolution, common descent, that opens up a whole other kind of problem for the amount of suffering, over time, to kind of seems like a clunky way to build, kind of the reality you see. It's kind of like blood-soaked wheel of history, for a while.
Yep.
And so I think I've said this before, but if I became convinced again that theism was true, I would have to embrace some form of animal afterlife, because it just seems, when we're saying like this being is perfect and has perfect goodness, it just seems, I don't want to say crazy. It just seems amazing that
right.
such a being would allow that without some kind of compensation. And so I think, and that's the other thing too, is when I think there's an advantage for skeptics or atheists, whatever. One of the advantages I see in pushing and discussing the problem of evil is not just to change people's minds to make them not a Christian or not a theist anymore, even though I think that does happen and can happen. But it seems like the more we kind of are able to articulate these problems of suffering, then it almost forces more empathetic theodicies to
Yes.
deal with the issues.
Right. And so one of the things that I just kind of find, particularly when it comes to one of the things that I am very grateful to atheists for, as a theist, is atheists are idol smashers par excellence. Like if there's an inconsistent, a false idea of God that theists hold, the atheists can just tear it up. And I think a theist needs to be grateful for that. And say kind of like, okay, well, maybe I need to actually rethink this understanding of God. And I think of, you mentioned, animal afterlife, William Rowe with his classic, suffering fawn example really kind of forced me to think, like, can God do right by these suffering animals. And I was thinking about, even dinosaurs, all these pre-human animals, and realizing that there is an anthropocentric understanding of the material world that is flawed. I mean, for all we know, we're the only humans or humanoids around, I mean, and God did all this other stuff too. I mean, like I think probably, God's got more than just us on the brain, So there's a it as you say, it kind of it invites us to a greater empathy to just all sentient creatures. And if God really ultimately when it comes to things like the problem of evil, when we're considering these questions, if we find that we are more compassionate than our understanding of God, then our understanding of an all-loving God is probably flawed, and we need to rework a little bit. That may mean having to do aside with certain ideas and doctrines we like, or that have we've grown to attach to. But yeah,
I would say for me, something that I'm still thinking through, like moral ontology, how that kind of stuff. So I would say for theism, I'm still kind of wrestling with it and figuring out what I think, but I would say variations of moral arguments are more convincing to me than other kinds of arguments, just because. And I know that there's like I've read like Eric Wielenberg, how he has almost like a Platonist kind of, he's an atheist and has ways of grounding morality, but it's still interesting because there's other, rather than just the ontological moral ontology problem, there's also like moral epistemology. Even if you have this objective, how does it connect? How do we know? It's one thing to ground moral ontology without God. It's another thing to say like, how does that, whatever that is, connect to like our moral knowledge? So there's that connection problem as well. That, but anyway, like I said, I'm not sure exactly what I think about all that right now, but I would just say of the arguments that I'm considering for theism, those are the most interesting, at least to me. But yeah, so in kind of stereotypically, I would say arguments from suffering and evil, kind of, that was what tipped me from agnosticism to atheism. Was actually probably during reading that dialogue book, Is God the Best Explanation of Thing, where it's like each philosopher was kind of presenting the side and going back and forth. It just seemed like it was like divided into three sections. Like the first section was, is there a foundation to the universe? And it was more like contingency sort of arguments. And then the middle was like, is this foundation personal? And so that they would debate about. So it's like kind of in steps. Like, is there some kind of necessary foundation? Okay. And there was actually more agreement than I expected. Because sometimes atheists can say that there's a necessary thing, but they just wouldn't call that thing God. And right. And so there was that, and then it was like started to get a little bit more disagreement. Is the foundation personal? And then it moved to, is the foundation good? Was the last section, and that was more like in the problem of suffering. And that's where I think, at least in my opinion, it was Josh Rasmussen and Felipe Leon. I think that the atheist side won the day in my opinion, at least in that section. And it just seems, again, I have a lot more reading to do. I'm not an expert or anything on like contingency arguments and stuff like that, but at least personally, those kind of feel so armchair, versus like some of the variations of the argument from evil seem more concrete. Like it's more empirical in a way. I mean, you're still using philosophical arguments, but to me, that's the worry I have, where it's like I don't know, just in one hand, it's like you get from armchair to God, and then the other, it's like you're actually observing external reality and coming to conclusions. And I find those kind of empirical sort of arguments more convincing. Then again, that may just say something about my personal psychology and not what's true, but that's just me. I'm just explaining kind of where I come at this from. But
and honestly, it makes kind of sense. And I really like that more step-by-step approach, because there's kind of a false urgency that I think a lot of apologists, for example, will want to kind of push, where like let's say, you know, they'll make a solid argument from contingency, you know, for a necessary being, and the big therefore from that is be baptized, and you know, it's like, well, you know, we went from A to Z really quick and kind of skipped all those other letters, you know, but the slower approach would be kind of like okay, well, we don't know if there's even Z out there, but we might be able to get from A to B. And then let's just sit with that for a while and see where that leads us, you know, and maybe that leads us back to A, you know, maybe it leads us to C. Like, who knows? But yeah, but this kind of step-by-step approach and realizing that, you know, hey, that's okay, you know, we're all trying to. None of us have this all figured out. And I think that's something that Christians and theists also need to recognize, that we don't have this all figured out.
But I do. So, so I guess we've hit about around an hour. So what kind of as a final leading out question, do you have any long-term, so what are your long-term plans? I guess Jesuit priest, is there any other than anything else that you have on, like with your education or anything like that?
Yeah, no, I have never, like I realized a couple years ago, I mean, I've only been around 33 years, but anytime I would have imagined where I would be 5 years from now at any point in my life, I've never once been accurate. So I figured, you know what, let me just ride the wave and go with the flow, because really, what's the use of my planning?
Do you have any other sort of content planned other than just Twitter? Or you're just kind of feeling Twitter out, like blogging or YouTube or anything like that? Just Twitter for now.
Right now, it's just Twitter and studies.
Right.
And,
yeah, you probably
work.
Time.
Yeah.
Probably doing a lot of stuff. Yeah. So, well, I really appreciate you being generous with your time. Thanks for coming on and having a conversation. I'm going to end the broadcast, but we can talk maybe for like a minute after this. So,
Sure.
Yeah, really appreciate you coming on. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.